Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Ink to Paper Stories and Interviews. I'm your host, h.a.spector. I hope you all enjoyed our first guest, Jacob Tice, and our discussion on writing fight scenes. This week, though, we are diving into the topic of the journey of indie publishing. I'm excited to jump into this interview because I learn best from others' experiences and cannot wait to hear from our guest. So with all of that said, let's jump straight into today. Today's guest is an indie published author of the Undead Uprising. She has also edited several books and has served as a ghostwriter for a memoir. She's also a fellow MFA student at Southern New Hampshire University. So please join me in welcoming to the show, Chloe Longstreet. Hey, Chloe.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Thank you for taking this time to jump on the show and talk about your experience. I think it's definitely important. A lot of authors, I know myself, when I first started out in the MFA program, I was like, I'm gonna be a traditionally published author. I know it's a really low chance of getting accepted, but I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna break I'm gonna break through the noise and get there. And there's just, the reality is that most writers will never make it into traditional publishing. Like, they're never going to get a traditional published deal. And so where does that leave them, right? That leaves them with other options. Or for some writers, they don't want to do that because they want, more control over their books, or there's something else that they don't want to give up with the traditional published deal. So I think this conversation is very good for all writers to listen to and keep in the back of their mind, depending on what path they want to take in the publishing world. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience.
Yeah, definitely.
So, as always, I'll go ahead and start with some general icebreaker questions. So, when did you first know you wanted to be a writer?
I was like 7.
Nice.
Yeah, I started writing stories way back then. I actually, kind of a funny, embarrassing story. When I was probably, 4th grade, so I would have been 9. The teacher would put words on the board, vocabulary words every day, and I always wrote this fiction story about how I ended up kissing one of the boys on the playground, and it was always a different boy every time. So I don't know. And then I always was the one that raised my hand to read my story, and I must have been a really good writer because the teacher just thought it was really funny, because the teacher always let me read my story out loud in front of the class, and you could see the boys in the class cringing when I got up. Is it going to be me this week? Am I going to be the boy that she kisses on the playground this week? But, even at that young age, I was writing fiction. I was writing these stories, and I was apparently good enough to get called on every day.
Hey, that's all the validation you need, right? As a youngster to continue to press on.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I love it when people say oh yeah, I knew I wanted to be a writer from a young age, because it's watching, then we get to watch now how you've just followed through with that dream, right? And now you have a published book, and so it's cool to see that come to life X amount of years later.
Yeah, a lot of years later for me, but I'm doing it, so that's what matters.
No one's counting the years. You're fine. So what inspired you to seek your MFA degree?
So I was actually going to SNHU to get an MS in marketing. I've been doing marketing for about 10 years now. It's I go back and forth. I'm like, oh, I want to work with writers and I want to edit and, all that. And then I'm like, no, I want to be a marketer because it makes lots of money and money is good. And I mean, money is good. I'm not going to lie. It'd be nice to be able to be more comfortable financially. But
yeah.
And this is crazy woo-woo stuff, but I started doing these meditations. And one of them was like a manifestation program, a 10-week manifestation program. And during the middle of it, I was just like, what am I doing? Why am I getting an MS in marketing? I want to write. This is my dream. This is what I've wanted to do since I'm a little girl. This is stupid. And so I called up my advisor and I was like, I want to switch to the MFA program. And she was like, what? And I was like, yeah, I've been doing all these meditations and I want to be a writer. And I swear the woman thought I was crazy. I mean, maybe I am. But yeah, so that's what got me to switch.
I think we all have to be a little bit crazy to go for MFA degree. Because after I joined the program, I did a lot of research on it, and I was like, it's just, there's not a lot of money to be made necessarily unless you get lucky. But you know what? It's a passion and it's a dream. So that's what's the important part.
Yeah. And it is.
No, I mean, and I'm also a huge supporter of meditation. So all good there. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
I'm glad you found your way to your true passion.
It's the best decision I've ever made, I think. I am so happy in the MFA program.
That's awesome. And then what's your favorite genre to write in? And bonus question, what is your favorite genre to read?
So the same. I am pretty solid science fiction fantasy, really more science fiction and like apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic dystopian science fiction. I'm not only going to write in that genre, like the ideas sort of come to me, and it's not like I'm writing in a genre and then writing stories because they're in that genre. I have story ideas and then I write them and they fall into whatever genre they do. But the majority of my stories are, you know, post-apocalyptic, apocalyptic, dystopian.
That's
A
awesome.
little bit of horror. Yeah,
Just a touch of horror.
just a touch.
We all need a little touch of horror. That's my
Yeah.
personal opinion anyway.
You do a lot of horror, right?
I aspire to do a lot of horror.
Yeah, that's your genre. Yeah.
I'm currently writing a fantasy book because I tried to write a horror book and it wasn't going well. So
Oh,
I had a fantasy idea brewing. So I was like, let me just switch to that. And it's going better for now, but I definitely plan to write horror.
yeah. Horror can be hard to write.
Mm-hmm.
Because you really have to be like creepy enough. And I think now we're so like, there's so much horror in our lives that we're sort of like
Yeah.
not connected. Like, it's harder to scare people, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
No, I mean it is for sure, and also like you have to capture. There's an expectation there from the reader that their emotions are going to be heightened and pulled on and played with, and so you have to really connect them to the character so they feel those emotions intensely.
Yeah.
Which can be tough to do for sure. So today's discussion is around the publishing journey of which you have walked before, Chloe. So I think the first question that I want to jump into for today is, as you finished up your manuscript, The Undead Uprising, what made you decide to journey down the indie publishing lane as opposed to querying and trying for a trad publishing deal?
Yeah. So, kind of, it's a longish answer because I actually finished the first draft of The Undead Uprising almost 12 years ago now.
Okay.
So, and then, I got pregnant with my daughter and I was a mom. And I think at some point I considered querying and doing traditional publishing, but I really wanted to do indie from the beginning.
Yeah.
Back then it wasn't called indie. Indie wasn't really a term yet. It was self-publishing. And there was still a lot of like really negative connotation around it. But, while I was waiting to publish my book and having setbacks because being a mom and being a writer are hard to combine,
Yeah.
I learned a lot about indie publishing, and I watched the indie publishing industry kind of grow and become what it is today. And I just really always was like, this book is going to be indie published. Yeah, I don't know. I just that was what I wanted to do with it, and not because it'll fit better or I don't want to lose control over my book. It was just like, this is what I want to do and there's some advantages. Like, for one, I can build an audience with my book so that if I do decide to go traditional, I can say, hey, I already have readers. I already
Yeah.
have, X number of sales on this book that I did all by myself. It's also just, you get a lot more of the profits. And like with your first book, you're not selling much,
Yeah.
Granted, you're putting a lot of money into it. I mean, I am definitely not going to be in the green on this book anytime soon. It's very, very, very much in the red, but I don't know. There's just something about indie. Like, I just never even really was a consideration in my head to go traditional with this book. And I mean, even like I'm writing a trilogy right now, and I'll attempt to query it just to see what happens, but I'm
Yeah.
probably going to go indie with my trilogy as well.
Yeah.
After that, I don't know. We'll see. But
Well, I mean, there's definitely a pipeline there, right? There's a lot of authors who have started indie and then eventually use that as leverage, like you said. You gain your readers, you get your audience, you have your sales numbers, and as those goes up and up and up as you grow your following, then you can use that to your advantage to leverage out a much better and more lucrative traditional publishing contract when you decide to
Mhm.
go that direction, which then may, help with the finances and things like that. So it's like, you're putting in a little bit, you're doing your time, you're putting in a little bit of your, your own resources, your own work to it in order to, but maybe eventually go big. But then you have other authors like Frida McFadden, for example, who's one of the most like successful indie authors that I've heard of anyway, who never
Mhm.
goes traditional. And I don't think ever, I mean, at least to my knowledge, has either never tried or doesn't care or whatever. But she has such a big following now that all of her books, I think, are self-published. I could be wrong.
I mean, this is something, I love SNHU and I love the MFA program, but the professors are taught to teach us like, oh, there's a lot of writers who have to supplement. Most writers have to supplement. You can't make a living off of your writing. And that's not true in the indie world.
Yeah.
There are a lot of indie writers who are making a very good, sometimes six-figure income off of their writing. Granted, they're doing all the other stuff themselves. Like they're not just writing,
Right.
but they're hiring people. They're like, hey, I'm making 200,000 a year, 250,000 a year. So I've got an assistant, and I've got this person, and I've got that person. It can be very lucrative if you're
Yeah.
in the right genre. I mean, that's the big thing. You have to be the right genre, and you're willing to put the work in.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that those are some considerations that people should, whoever's out there that's listening, keep those considerations in mind when you're finishing up your manuscripts, you're going through editing, and you're deciding, do you want to query or do you want to just try for self-publishing? Keep some of those considerations in mind, like your profit margins are going to be bigger per book sale, and also you do have more control, and you also have that ability, like Chloe said, to build that audience and connect with your reader. Because it's much more of from what I see, it's a much more close-knit community.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it is, and I said earlier, genre is super important because some genres just are never going to do well with indie, or at least they haven't so far. I mean, maybe that would change, and it's good to do research, like look into the top selling books in your genre, see how many copies they're selling, look at like what they're making at the time when they're a top selling book, and then just kind of keep an eye on like, look at the top selling book, look at the number 100 on the bestsellers list, and get an idea of like, this is the range that I could be making if I make the bestsellers list in my genre. And like, is that
Yeah.
something I'm comfortable with? Like, you really have to do a lot of research. So many people are like, oh, I queried, and this is fine. Like, I'm not negating this choice, but a lot of people are like, oh, I queried, I got tired of querying, I got tired of the rejection, so I decided to self-publish. And like, that's great if you just want to get your book out there, but if you want to be a successful indie author, that might not be the best way to go about it.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I think a lot of people have that conception, right? That you just post it and you can just like post your book and then just leave it, right? And it just goes. And then you're like, oh, it'll sell, right? Because it's out there and people will find it on Amazon because Amazon's massive, and or whatever site you're using to sell your book on. And then that's just not the truth, right? You do have to have some intentionality behind it if you do have hopes of making profit on a book eventually. Unless you're a hobby writer and you don't care about the money and you're just like, I'll throw it out there and see what happens. I guess it's one approach to it. But for those that are serious about trying to make it a career, there definitely has to be some intentionality, with marketing and things like that. I would assume.
Yeah, and knowing what you're doing, and or being able to hire people who know what they're doing. I mean, there's just so much to it. And like, even with this book, I knew what I was getting into when I did it. I mean, I've been studying indie marketing for a decade, like following people who are doing it online on social media, watching them go through the process, researching the steps to take, keywords, marketing, yada yada, all of that. And still, when I sat down to do it for the first time, I screwed up a lot of stuff. And I didn't do it perfect. And like, it was really, really, really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And that's like trying to do everything right so that, my next book maybe will do better.
Yeah.
You're putting yourself out there just as much as when you query. It's just a different kind of putting yourself out there.
Yeah. And I think that's an important note there too, is that hopefully your next book does better. What a lot of people don't realize too, what I've learned through this MFA program and through like studying traditional publishing and hearing, other authors' stories with the process, I think to keep in mind is that like with indie publishing, right, there is room for you to put out a book, it do okay or, not great, but it's your first attempt. And then use that leverage to then put out your next book. And so maybe you have, dozens of readers or tens of readers, or maybe even you get to 100 readers or whatever. But then you can use that leverage and say, okay, well, my next book, those readers will hopefully migrate to my next book. And then maybe I can grow off of that because my next book will be better. My next book will be better. Because they always say as a writer, every story you write is an improvement on the last story you wrote. But with traditional publishing, something to keep in mind is that sometimes if your first book doesn't do well, and I'm not saying this is all the time, but sometimes if your first book doesn't do well, you're never going to get that second book deal.
No.
Because you've already proven that you can't sell a book to at least in the minds of the traditional publishers.
Yeah. Well, and if you go traditional, like the failure of your book could be on someone else, and then you never get another deal again. Where
Right.
if you go indie, at least if it fails, it's all on you, and you can learn from your mistakes and be like, okay, next time I'm going to do better.
Yeah.
And like if you have a first book that doesn't do well, it might just be because you're a new author. It's not just because it's not a good book. And so then, your second book, third book, fourth book, I mean, talking to other indie authors, the general rule of thumb is you're not going to start making any kind of money until your fourth or fifth book.
Yeah.
Because then people they might find the fifth book and they're like, oh, I love this author. And then they'll go back and they'll read 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Right.
And then you've got sales of 5 books from that one reader. Where, like, if you only have one book out, they might like the book, but then what do? They're not going to read another book because you don't have it.
Right.
So,
yeah. I think that's why, because I've heard a lot of indie publishers, talk about their backlist and constantly, like, don't forget those books, right? Like, as you're putting out new books, always look for ways to either refresh or re-promote your backlist with those new books you're coming out with, too. And I think that probably leans into that with, hey, if you like, hey, this is book 4, and if you like it, I have 3 others that you should check out. Like, you're constantly keeping that in your reader's mind.
Yeah, well, and there's like an art form to it. Like some indie authors, a lot of the ones that are actually making money, they're publishing series. And we're talking like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like long series. And, one of the strategies is, you have maybe 2 or 3 books that you are offering for free. Like nobody has to pay anything for them. But let's say book 3 ends on a cliffhanger. Then book 4, you charge 99 cents. And then book 5, 6, and 7, it's $3.99. So you get people into the series. And then, they're like, yes, I will pay $4 to figure out what happens to these characters that I'm now invested in and in love with.
Yeah.
There's a lot of strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think that strategy continues? I mean, like, so what about someone who doesn't write series, right? And they write standalones. How do you amend that strategy to kind of still fit that, right? Like there's not necessarily characters unless you're using a character through different stories. And so it's not necessarily a series, but maybe it's a character series, if you will. But like, how does that strategy apply there if you're writing standalones?
You just want to make sure that your genre is right and that they're similar enough that if someone finds one book, you've got the same target market. So
yeah.
As an example, for my MFA thesis, I'm probably going to write a thriller about a female serial killer. That has nothing to do with the other books that I'm writing. Like, I'm doing all this apocalyptic fiction. So I'm considering trying to traditionally publish that under a pen name because it's so different from the other stuff that I write. And if I self-publish it, then people who find that are going to read my other stuff and be like, this isn't the same style of writing. Like, it's the same style, but it's not the same. If you do write standalone fiction, you've got to find some sort of thing to tie it in and then find your target audience and market it with that thing. So, like, for my books, I could say, like, they all have a strong female lead who tends to end the book or the series in tragedy, right?
Yeah.
So there's some sort of tragic thing that happens. So you fall in love with this female lead and then, like, you're like, oh my God, she's dead. Or whatever.
Yeah.
And that could tie all of my books in together because that's what happens. And so then I have to find people who are into that sort of story that are okay if it's horror or thriller or post-apocalyptic. They don't care about the genre. They care about this character.
Right.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah. So like you have to everything has to tie together somehow if you want to keep people devouring basically all of your books.
Yeah. No, I mean, that definitely makes sense. I think that's a marketing a marketing strategy that, and I'm horrible at like coming up with that. So I'm probably going to be the guy that hires a marketer to help me if I ever go indie publishing. I mean, even if I go traditional publishing nowadays, you're not even guaranteed to get marketing. So you may have to hire a marketer anyway on your own. But, you said something a little while ago about learning through your mistakes or through your failures or through your early like bumps in the road. And so the next question that came to mind is, what's the biggest piece of advice you learned through the whole process of indie publishing that you wish you would have known from the start?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question for me because I have been studying indie publishing for so long before I actually took the dive and did it.
Yeah.
I don't know, like for me, I knew all the things to do, but the actual process of doing them all was really overwhelming. And
Mhm.
so I don't know if it's necessarily advice that I heard from someone that I wish I'd known from the start because the start was so long ago for me. But I wish that like I had had better organization, like a checklist or like,
Yeah.
something where it was like, okay, you get your editing done and you do your keywords and this is the keyword research and make sure you're doing that because there's so many little things that you have to do to get your book out there. And when it's your first time, even if you know what all the little things are, keeping track of them and remembering them is really, really, really hard.
Yeah.
Especially if you have ADHD like I do, because I'm not good at organizing and keeping track of things. And I don't even know if a list would have helped because I probably would have
Yeah.
looked at the list and done like 3 things on it and then forgotten it existed and just did my own thing anyway. But yeah, just keeping, everything organized. If I were like to say, okay, I'm a first time writer, I'm going into indie publishing, I would say book cover.
Yeah.
Book cover and marketing. Like editing's great. You definitely want to have a good book. But if you've got a good cover and your marketing is on point, you'll at least get people picking up the book. And then if it sucks,
They already paid for it.
they've already paid for it. Yeah. Um and that's something, obviously you don't want that to happen,
Yeah.
but everyone's like, "Oh, book cover." But like I tried to design my own book cover and like when I originally was pushing this book and trying to promote it, I had a completely different cover, The
Yeah.
Undead Uprising, and like the difference in responses that I've gotten having the cover that I have now versus the cover that I made is insane.
Yeah.
And I still think the cover's off, and that's something that I'm working through right now is that I'm getting some DNFs on the book where I'm like, "Oh, someone read 166 pages and then walked away." And so I think that some of it is the cover because it's a zombie apocalypse novel, but it's not like the militaristic, like everyone's out to kill each other
Yeah.
apocalyptic novel. And so people look at the cover and they're expecting something, and it's not necessarily that. So
Gotcha.
but, it's just and it's like a constant test, like, "Okay, let's do this. Okay, this is getting good response." Like, people are downloading, people are excited with the cover, but now I'm losing them at this other place.
Yeah.
So then you have to figure out, like, what am I doing wrong that's losing them here? And, you fix that and then
Yeah.
go on. Or you just write the next book and
Hope
hope
for
it
the
all
best.
works out. Yeah.
Yeah. So many strategies. So many strategies you
Yeah.
could do. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an important thing to key in on is using those key indicators to figure out how to improve your writing. If you're losing people at 160 pages, roughly the middle-ish of the book or getting into the middle of the book, depending on how long your book is, obviously there's something there, right? Like maybe your characters aren't compelling enough, or maybe the middle is just not introduced well. And so it feels like, people are getting lost in the story. Or I like to say on the outside, I'm like, oh yeah, I love critique. I love when people tell me what's wrong with my stuff. And then inside, I'm like, when people are telling me, I'm like, oh, thank you so much. And then I'm like inside just crying. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
but I think it's super important, right, to key in on those things. What are they trying to tell me here? They're trying to tell me like that this is not strong or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and you like might be pissed off at first. Like when I got my draft of the Undead Uprising back from my developmental editor, I went through it and then I like had to shut it down and walk away for a couple of days because I was mad. I'm
Yeah,
like, how does she not see that I answered these questions? Like it's clearly in the book. But then I came back to it and I said, okay, is this really actually clear? And sometimes I felt like it was, even though she didn't feel like it was, and I didn't change things. But most of the stuff I went through question by question and I changed it and I fixed it and I made it more clear, and then I sent it to the next editor and there was still stuff wrong with it. And I was like, no, I fixed this. And I got mad, but then you walk away and you come back and you're like, no, there's a reason this person isn't catching on to what I'm trying to say here. And I need to make sure that I'm being really clear. And then it's like every step of the process, that's what happens. Like you see something and you're like, oh, that stupid jerk, right? Like, how could they
Yeah.
not see this? But then you're like, wait, maybe. And then sometimes you reflect and you think maybe they're right. And then you're like, no, they're not right. This is good the way it is. But sometimes
Right.
you're like, oh yeah, like that really sucks, or I'm really being unclear here, or, I can add this little detail and just make it so much better.
Yeah.
But it requires, it's okay to like get mad and then have to step away and come back to it.
Yeah.
And you probably will.
Yeah.
Like,
Just prepare for it now.
yeah, just prepare for it now. You'll want to like throw your laptop at your editor, but they're in the UK, so you can't. Like it's just gonna happen.
That's when you send the like a table flip meme
Yeah.
to them.
Yeah.
But keying in a little bit more on marketing, I know we talked about a few things, but do you have any additional tips when it comes to marketing as an indie published author?
I would just say like learn as much as you can before you get out there. PR is harder as an indie author because it's weird because so there's so many elements of marketing. You've got PR and then you've got like social media, digital marketing, and like a lot of traditionally published books tend to push more on like the PR side of things where you're going to be in the newspapers, you're going to be doing signings, maybe even on the news, radio, whatever. And like that can be a little bit harder as an indie author to do. If you can find those opportunities, definitely go for them. But for indies, a lot of it is more social media and digital marketing. So like having your newsletters, having your website, social media. And social media is sort of my jam. So I do a lot of that because I do it for work. So I enjoy it. Some of the other stuff I'm like, oh, I'm banging my head against the wall. Like I still haven't done a book signing and my book published 4 months ago.
Yeah.
Because I was burnt out, and then it was my daughter's birthday, and then it was Thanksgiving, and then it was Christmas, and then I struggle with seasonal affective disorder. So like all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, it's February. And I'm just like, I'm going to do a half birthday book signing. That's what I'm doing,
There you go.
April 18th, because I just couldn't do it back then.
Yeah.
And like, that's the thing is an indie, like you don't have someone doing all of that stuff for you. So, I think with a lot of marketing, it's really like the biggest piece of advice I would give anyone is like, figure out what you're good at with marketing and what you enjoy and really just double down on that, whether it's ads, whether it's social media, whether it's like going out in public and like arranging book signings, contacting newspapers and trying to have stuff in PR. Like you're not going to be able to do everything.
Yeah.
Especially if it's your first or second or third book. You're just not. Like even me as someone who does marketing for a living, like you can't do everything.
Yeah.
So just, do what you like and then you're going to do better than if you try to do something you hate.
Yeah. Those are important things to remember. And I think, to plug in a little bit with the, with the things like signings and PR part of it, I think connecting with your local literary landscape, like your local bookstores or libraries. So really connecting with your local literary landscape to get yourself out there. I think that a lot of people think online is the only way. And yes, online is like probably your biggest, that's your biggest market. You have access to the world, but
No, and that's something, I've got 2 local libraries that said they would put my book in. You couldn't do that 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The libraries could not carry indie published books.
Yeah.
So that's changed. I ordered through the ISBN agency, Bowker. They offered to sell me a barcode as well, and I ordered that. And this is like things you learn, right? So I paid $25 for a barcode. So I'm like, oh, it'll make my book look more professional, right?
Yeah.
Turns out Amazon and Barnes & Noble Print, they put their own barcode over my barcode. And there was like, even though Amazon says they won't do it, they did. And so I've got like double barcodes on my books. And, again, what I was saying earlier, I've been struggling the past couple of months with just life. So I didn't get it fixed until just now. So like my book could have been in a library this whole time, but I can't give it to them with the double barcode because that looks really bad. And it can also mess up when they're scanning it or whatever. And like same thing with local bookstores. Like I haven't even tried to get it into a local bookstore because this double barcode issue.
Yeah.
And so, it's like these little things that you learn over time that get better that you might not know. Like I had no idea even though I've studied this for forever, that like spending $25 on a barcode was going to screw all of these things up for me.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, all that is to say, like, you'll learn lessons and don't beat yourself up. But I think it's super awesome that indie authors can get into local bookstores and libraries now, because 10 years ago, it was completely impossible.
Yeah. Well, it shows how the literary community as a whole has really adopted and accepted indie publishing as a legitimate thing. And so it's exciting to see that grow and come into its own and have its own following. And you don't have to wait for Simon and Schuster to tell you what book to read next. You have a world of indie authors that you can discover at your fingertips nowadays, which is great.
Yeah, well, and I definitely have to give a shout out to the indie authors that have worked to professionalize it, because I think that if it was just a bunch of people who were sitting down writing a book and posting it on Amazon without doing any work on it, that we wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
But the indie industry has had a lot of people that have worked really hard. We're editing, we're marketing, we're doing book cover design. Like, we're modeling what the traditional industry does in our own books and spending our own money on it to produce a professionally published book. And that has given the industry a lot of legitimacy.
Yeah, for sure. Let's get into inspiration. It's a big shift from what we were just talking about, but I love talking to authors about what inspires them, what makes them tick creatively. So what inspired you to write The Undead Uprising, and how did you keep yourself motivated through every stage of that project? Because as I'm learning as an MFA student and in thesis currently, motivation is my greatest enemy. I have to figure out how to keep pushing myself to get word count in and things like that.
Yeah. So all of my story ideas come to me in dreams, and they're always like very weird dreams where like I'm not myself. I'm like somebody else, or I'm looking at it from third person and watching it play out like a scene in my head.
Yeah.
And it might just be a scene that then turns into a story. So for the Undead Uprising, I woke up and like I had this dream where this woman was standing up on a hill shooting arrows down at zombies that were like attacking a group of people that were trying to get onto a bus in a hotel parking lot.
Yeah. That's specific. I love that.
It was super specific. And then it just turned into like the woman on the hill was a vampire, and then it was like, the disease, the zombies were actually like a vampire zombie disease combination, and that vampires are real, zombies aren't, because if zombies were real, we'd all be zombies. But the vampire disease morphed into a zombie disease, and that's how zombies happened. And then like the book just happened from there.
That's really cool.
But yeah, that's where my inspiration comes from. As far as like motivation, that's a hard thing to answer, because I wrote The Undead Uprising during Nano of 2012. I wrote the whole thing in 1 month, just sat down, did it. And then I like would edit a chapter here, edit a chapter there, but it took me another 10 years before I was like, okay, I need to sit down and take this seriously.
Yeah.
And again, that was around the time I started the MFA program. I had the whole meditation thing where I'm like, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. And I don't want to do anything else anymore. Like, this is what makes me happy. And for some reason, like going through those meditations and that manifestation thing and just really doing that soul searching, like that's what gave me the motivation where I've now been sustaining, writing on a regular basis and finishing my books for a year and a half now.
That's exciting.
Yeah. Like I did Nano and then I just kind of like piddled with it. And then all of a sudden I'm like, no, this is it. And for me to sustain a year and a half of like writing regularly is huge.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and wrap things up. I do have one more question for you before we end today's interview, and I really appreciate your time. What tools would you recommend authors use to market themselves and their books?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously everyone's going to have different views on this depending on what they do. But for myself, as someone who's been doing marketing for a while for other companies, Canva is going to be your best friend, because realistically, as a writer, unless you are one of those really big writers, you're not going to afford Photoshop. And Canva is really user-friendly and it doesn't have a huge learning curve. And then I use SocialPilot for social media scheduling, which like not a lot of people know about. Everyone's like, oh, Hootsuite or whatever. SocialPilot is a lot cheaper than any of those other options. You can hook up multiple social media platforms to it. You can like go in. So like I'll go in and I'll say, okay, here's this post I want to do, and I'll set it up for Instagram, and then I can go in and I can like take the image off and change the hashtags for threads, and then I can like shorten it for Twitter and take the image off for Twitter, and then I can like lengthen it for LinkedIn and add more professional details but keep the image. And you can really like tweak it for each platform, like knowing like what sort of content does well on that platform. And then you can take it and you can schedule it, but then you can move it. So you can say like, hey, this is going to go live on Instagram today, but it's not going to go live on LinkedIn for 2 weeks.
Right.
And you can have it. So you sit down and you do one post, but like you can do 10 posts and schedule a month's worth of social media content and have it all go at different times. And it's really user friendly the way that it works.
Yeah.
And it's cheap. It's like $30 a month, which is like, I think Hootsuite is like 60 or 70 now. I don't know. I haven't looked in a while, but it's definitely a lot more expensive than SocialPilot. So,
awesome.
As an author, it's worth it.
Social media is a big part of marketing in general. So
yeah.
Cool. Well, we'll definitely include those links to those tools that you mentioned, and we'll put those in the show notes. So if anyone wants to check them out, if you're out there and you're writing, those tools will definitely come in handy. So I appreciate you sharing them.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Chloe. But before we say goodbye, let's wrap it up with a little segment that I like to call, Hey, Chloe, what you reading? So as we did in the first episode, we're back to ask our guest one final question, and that is, what you reading? And as a bonus, what is the book that's sitting at the top of your TBR pile waiting to be read?
I am reading, so it's the series by James S.A. Corey, starting with Leviathan Wakes. I think it's called the Expanse series. I am on book 3.
Okay.
And I actually just started it like really, really recently. But apparently it's way more popular than I realized, but it just popped up in my Kindle and I started reading it. Yeah, I mean, really when it comes to reading and TBR though, like 90% of the time I just go by what my Kindle Unlimited suggests for me, and then I read it. And, every once in a while I start a 7-book series, and I'm like telling my daughter and my fiance, like, you guys aren't gonna, have me around for a couple of days because I'm gonna disappear. And it's a good mix. I do a mix between indie and traditionally. I actually probably do a lot more indie because I am the target market for someone who wants someone that reads Kindle Unlimited books voraciously, because I'll tear into them until I get to the point where I've read too many that haven't been edited well, and then I step away for a while and go to the library and be like, give me a traditionally published book, please. So, yeah. That was a very long rambling answer, but
no, that's great. I kind of like that you just let the suggestions or like the next, like your next read be like, oh, this is what we recommend based off your reading, or here's the top recommendation. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, Kindle probably loves me because I'm like their perfect reader. They're like, here's this book. I'm like, okay.
I'll do it.
Yeah, but sometimes the algorithm gets funky. I read a dragon book. I love fantasy dragon books, but I read one series one time, and then all of a sudden I just started getting these like really poorly written dragon fantasies that, not poorly written. They were well written. They had good storyline, but they were not well edited.
Yeah.
And so, I'm like reading it, and, I get to like the 3rd or 4th chapter. I'm like, oh my God, I can't finish this book. And I want to finish it, but it's giving me a headache.
Yeah.
And so then I had to like retrain my algorithm, which happens. But yeah, algorithms are fun.
I didn't know Kindle Unlimited had an algorithm.
I
don't know why I didn't think that. I just figure everything has an algorithm, but I don't know. I just never thought that was a thing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And if you're on Kindle and they're suggesting books that you hate, you go out and ask people that read books that you like to give you some suggestions. Read some of those, and then you'll be right back on track to having books that you like again.
Love that.
Yeah.
That's a little bonus tip for all you out there who use Kindle Unlimited.
Yeah. Or if you're writing a book, you need to know what the algorithm is going to suggest to make sure that your keywords are correct, so that when Kindle introduces your book to your target reader, that it's actually aligned properly so they read your book and enjoy it.
Things to keep in mind. There's so many things to keep in mind when you're putting your stuff out there, but we'll add that one to the plate and that list of things to keep in mind as you're walking the journey of putting your art out there.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Chloe, for taking the time out of your day to come talk to us. I really learned a lot today, honestly, about the indie publishing world. I mean, even though I'm in the MFA program and I was supposed to study it, I studied it only when I needed to. So I really appreciate hearing some more of those insights from someone who's walked the path, has done the studying, has put a book out there. And I think that that'll benefit me in the long run. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. So last thing we'll leave off with is, where can listeners find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, so I am the only Chloe Longstreet out there as of right now. So it's pretty easy to just Google Chloe Longstreet. My Twitter handle is Chloe Longstreet. My Instagram is Longstreet Chloe, but still some version of Chloe Longstreet.
Yeah.
My Threads is Longstreet Chloe because it's Instagram. LinkedIn is Chloe Longstreet. You can Google Chloe Longstreet and all my stuff pops up. It's all me until you get to like the second or third page. So benefits of having a unique name, and I can share links below. But yeah, and I'm on lots of different social media channels. I don't have a website yet, but I am begrudgingly working on it. And that'll show up too because it's ChloeLongstreet.com.
Awesome.
I'm easy. Yeah.
Look at that. Where can listeners buy The Undead Uprising?
So The Undead Uprising is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble right now. You can either do an ebook or paperback, whichever you prefer. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, I am on Kindle Unlimited. You can read it for free.
Awesome. Well, that's perfect. We will put those links in the show notes for everybody, as always. And again, thank you, Chloe, for jumping on and talking with us today.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Ink to Paper Stories and Interviews. If you enjoyed today's show, please take a moment to leave us a rating and a review on whatever podcast platform you use to access the episode. It's the best way to help the show grow and reach a wider audience. If you are a writer, author, or storyteller across any medium and you want to appear on a future episode of the show, please send me an email at h.a.spectorwrites@gmail.com or send me a message on Bluesky at h.a.spectorwrites.bsky.social. As always, keep promoting your local libraries, support your local community bookstores by buying books, including banned ones, and keep on supporting the storytellers you know and love. All of these things help support a healthy and thriving literary landscape, whether you are a writer or a reader. And I will catch you all in the next chapter.